A visitor to England. Number 3, Chapter 3, The Wonderful World of Adam Smith, Worldly Philosophers, by Robert L. Heilbronner. A visitor to England in the 1760s would quite probably have learned of a certain Dr. Smith of the University of Glasgow. Dr. Smith was a well-known, if not a famous man. Voltaire had heard of him. David Hume was intimate. Students had traveled all the way from Russia to hear his labored but enthusiastic discourse. In addition to his scholastic accomplishments, Dr. Smith was known as a rather remarkable personality. He was, for example, notoriously absent-minded. Once he had fallen into a tanning pit, walking along in earnest disquisition with a friend, and it was said that he had brewed himself a beverage of bread and butter and pronounced it the worst cup of tea he had ever tasted. But his personal quirks, which were many, did not interfere with his intellectual abilities. Dr. Smith was among the foremost philosophers of his age. At Glasgow, Dr. Smith lectured on problems of moral philosophy, a discipline a great deal more broadly conceived in that day than in ours. Moral philosophy covered natural theology, ethics, jurisprudence, and political economy. It thus ranged all the way from man's sublimest impulses toward order and harmony to his somewhat less orderly and harmonious activities in the grimmer business of gouging out a living for himself. Natural theology, the search for design in the confusion of the cosmos, has been an object of the human rationalizing impulse from earliest times. Our traveler would have felt quite at ease had Dr. Smith expounded the natural laws that underlay the seeming chaos of the universe. But when it came to the other end of the spectrum, the search for a grand architecture beneath the hurly-burly of daily life, our traveler might have felt that Dr. Smith was really stretching philosophy beyond its proper limits. For if the English social scene of the late 18th century suggested anything, it was most emphatically not rational order nor moral purpose. As soon as one looked away from the elegant lives of the leisure class, society presented itself as a brute struggle for existence in its meanest form. Outside the drawing rooms of London, or the pleasant rich estates of the counties, all that one saw was rapacity, cruelty, and degradation, mingled with the most irrational and bewildering customs and traditions of some still earlier and already anachronistic day, rather than a carefully engineered machine where each part could be seen to contribute to the whole. The body social resembled one of James Watt's strange steam machines, black, noisy, inefficient, dangerous. How curious that Dr. Smith should have professed to see order, design, and purpose in all of this. Suppose, for example, our visitor had gone to see the tin mines of Cornwall. There he would have watched miners lower themselves down the black shafts and on reaching bottom draw a candle from their belts and stretch out for a sleep until the candle guttered. Then for 2 or 3 hours they would work the ore until the next traditional break. This time for as long as it took to smoke a pipe. A full half a day was spent in lounging, half in picking at the seams. But had our visitor traveled up north and nerved himself against a descent into the pits of Durham or Northumberland, he would have seen something quite different. Here men and women worked together, stripped to the waist, and sometimes reduced from pure fatigue to a whimpering half-human state. The wildest and most brutish customs were practiced. Sexual appetites aroused at a glance were gratified down some deserted shaft way. Children of 7 or 10 who never saw daylight during the winter months were used and abused and paid a pittance by the miners to help drag away their tubs of coal. Pregnant women drew coal cars like horses and even gave birth in the dark black caverns. But it was not just the mines that life appeared colorful, traditional, or ferocious. On the land, too, an observant traveler would have seen sights hardly more suggestive of order, harmony, and design. In many parts of the country, bands of agricultural poor roamed in search of work. From the Welsh Highlands, companies of ancient Britons, as they styled themselves, would come trooping down at harvest time. Sometimes they had one horse, unsaddled and unbridled, for the entire company. Sometimes they all simply walked. Not infrequently there would be only one of the lot who spoke English and so could serve as an intermediary between the band and the gentlemen farmers whose lands they asked permission to aid in harvesting. It is not surprising that wages were as low as sixpence a day. And finally, had our visitor stopped at the manufacturing town, he would have seen other remarkable sights, but again, not such as to betoken order to the uneducated eye. He might have marveled at the factory built by the brothers Lambe in 1742. It was a huge building for those days, 500 feet long and 6 stories high, and inside were machines described by Daniel Defoe as consisting of 26,586 wheels and 97,746 movements, which worked 73,726 yards of silk thread every time the water wheel goes around, which is 3 times in 1 minute. Equally worthy of note were the children who tended the machines round the clock for 12 or 14 hours at a turn, cooked their meals on the grimly black boilers, and were boarded in shifts in barracks where it was said the beds were always warm. A strange, cruel, haphazard world this must have appeared to 18th century as well as to our modern eyes. All the more remarkable, then, to find that it could be reconciled with a scheme of moral philosophy envisioned by Dr. Smith, and that learned man actually claimed to fathom within it a clear-cut outline of great purposeful laws fitting an overreaching and meaningful whole. What sort of man was this urban philosopher? I am endowed in nothing but my books, was the way Adam Smith once described himself, proudly showing off his treasured library to a friend. He was certainly not a handsome man. A medallion profile shows us a protruding lower lip thrust up to meet a large aquiline nose and heavy, bulging eyes looking out from heavy lids. All his life, Smith was troubled with a nervous affliction. His head shook, and he had an odd and stumbling manner of speech. In addition, there was his notorious absent-mindedness. In the 1780s, when Smith was in his late 50s, the inhibitions of Edinburgh were regularly treated to the amusing spectacle of their most illustrious citizen, attired in a light-colored coat, knee breeches, white silk stockings, buckle shoes, flat broad-brimmed beaver hat and cane, walking down the cobbled streets with his eyes fixed on infinity and his lips moving in silent discourse. Every pace or two he would hesitate as if no change to his direction, or even reverse it. His gait was described by a friend as vermicular. Accounts of his absence of mind were common. On one occasion, he descended into his garden clad only in a dressing gown and, falling into a riviere, walked 15 miles before coming to. Another time, while walking with an eminent friend in Edinburgh, a guard presented his pike in salute. Smith, who had been thus honored on countless occasions, was suddenly hypnotized by the saluting soldier. He returned the honor with his cane and then further astonished his guest by following exactly in the guard's footsteps. duplicating with his cane every motion of the pike. When the spell was broken, Smith was standing at the head of a long flight of steps, cane held at the ready, having no idea that he had done anything out of the ordinary. He grounded his stick and took up his conversation where he had left off. This absent-minded professor was born in 1723 in the town of Kirkcaldy, County File, Scotland. Kirkcaldy boasted a population of 1,500 at the time of Smith's birth. Nails were still used as money by some of the local townspeople. When he was 4 years old, a most curious incident took place. Smith was kidnapped by a band of passing gypsies. Through the efforts of his uncle, his father had died before his birth, the gypsies were traced and pursued. And in their flight, they abandoned young Adam by the roadside. He would have made, I fear, a poor gypsy, says one of the biographers. From his earliest days, Smith was an apt pupil, although even as a child, given to fits of abstraction. He was obviously destined for teaching, and so at 17 he went to Oxford on a scholarship, making the journey on horseback, and there he remained for 6 years. But Oxford was not the citadel of learning which it later became. Most of the public professors had long ago given up even a pretense of teaching. A foreign traveler recounts his astonishment over a public debate there in 1788. All 4 participants passed the allotted time in profound silence, each absorbed in reading a popular novel of the day. Since instruction was the exception rather than the rule, Smith spent the years largely untutored and untaught, reading as he saw fit. In fact, he was once nearly expelled from the university because a copy of David Hume's A Treatise of Human Nature was found in his room. Hume was no fit reading matter, even for a would-be philosopher. In 1751, he was then 28. Smith was offered the chair of logic at the University of Glasgow, and shortly thereafter he was given the chair of moral philosophy. Unlike Oxford, Glasgow was a serious center of study and boasted a galaxy of talent, but it still differed considerably from the modern conception of a university. The prim professional group did not entirely appreciate a certain levity and enthusiasm in Smith's manner. He was accused of sometimes smiling during religious services, no doubt during a reverie, of being a firm friend of that outrageous Hume, of not holding Sunday classes on Christian evidences, of petitioning the Senatus Academicus for permission to dispense with prayers on the opening of class, and of delivering prayers that smacked of certain natural religion. Perhaps this all fits into better perspective if we remember that Smith's own teacher, Hutchinson, broke new ground at Glasgow by refusing to lecture to his students in Latin. But for all the inevitable academic rivalry, Smith was happy at Glasgow. In the evenings he played whist. His absent-mindedness made him a somewhat undependable player, attended learned societies, and lived a quiet and sheltered life. He was beloved of his students, noted as a lecturer. Even Boswell came to hear him, and his odd gait and manner of speech gained the homage of imitation. Little bursts of himself even appeared in booksellers' windows. It was not merely his eccentric personality that gave him prestige. In 1759, he published a book which made him an instant sensation. It was entitled The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and it catapulted Smith immediately into the forefront of English philosophers. The theory was an inquiry into the origin of moral approbation and disapproval. How does it happen that man, who is a creature of self-interest, can form moral judgments in which self-interest seems to be held in abeyance or transmuted to a higher plane? Smith held that the answer lay in the ability to put ourselves in the position of a third person, an impartial observer, and in this way to form a sympathetic notion of the moral as opposed to the selfish merits of a case. The book and its problems attracted widespread interest. In Germany, Das Adam Smith problem became a favorite subject for debate. More importantly, from our point of view, the treatise met the favor of an intriguing man named Charles Townshend. Townshend is one of the wonderful figures with which the 18th century seems to abound. A witty and even learned man, Townshend was, in the words of Horace Walpole, a man endowed with every great talent, who must have been the greatest man of his age. If only he had common sincerity, common steadiness, and common sense. Townshend's fickleness was notorious. A quip of the times put it that Mr. Townshend was ill of a pain in his side, but declined to specify which side. As evidence of his lack of common sense, it was Townshend, a chancellor of the Exchequer, who helped precipitate the American Revolution. First, by refusing the colonists the right to elect their own judges, then by imposing a heavy duty on American tea. But his political short-sightedness notwithstanding, Townshend was a sincere student of philosophy and politics, and as such, a devotee of Adam Smith. Which is more important? He was in a position to make him an unusual offer. In 1754, Townshend had made a brilliant and lucrative marriage to the Countess of Dalkeith, the widow of the Duke of Buchenlech, and now found himself casting about for a tutor for his wife's son. Education for a young man of the upper classes consisted largely of the Grand Tour, a stay in Europe where one might acquire that polished finish so highly praised by Lord Chesterfield. Dr. Adam Smith would be an ideal companion for the young Duke, thought Townshend, and accordingly he offered him £300 a year, plus expenses, and a pension of £300 a year for life. It was too good an offer to be declined. At best, Smith never realized more than £170 from the fees which in those days professors collected directly from their students. It is pleasant to note that his pupils refused to accept a refund from Dr. Smith when he left, saying that they had already been more than recompensated. The tutor and his young grace left for France in 1764. For 18 months, they stayed in Toulouse, where a combination of abominably boring company and Smith's execrable French made his sedate life at Glasgow look like dissipation. Then they moved on to the south of France, where he met and worshipped Voltaire and repulsed the attentions of an amorous marquis. Thence to Geneva, and finally to Paris, to relieve the tedium of the provinces. Smith began work on a treatise of political economy, a subject on which he had lectured at Glasgow, debated many evenings at the Select Society in Edinburgh, and discussed at length with his beloved friend David Hume. The book was to be The Wealth of Nations, but it would be 12 years before it was finished. Paris was better going by this time. Smith's French, although dreadful, was good enough to enable him to talk at length with the foremost economic thinker in France. This was a M. Quesnay, a physician in the court of Louis XV, and personal doctor to M. Pompadour Quesnay, had propounded a school of economics known as physiocracy, and devised a chart of the economy called Tableau économique. The tableau was truly a physician's insight, in contradistinction to the ideas of the day, which still held that wealth was the solid stuff of gold and silver. Quesnay insisted that wealth sprang from the production and that it flowed through the nation, from hand to hand, replenishing the body social like the circulation of blood. The tableau made a vast impression. Mirabeau the elder characterized it as an invention deserving of equal rank with writing and money. But the trouble with physocracy was that it insisted that only the agricultural classes produced true wealth, and that the manufacturing and commercial classes merely manipulated it in a sterile way. Hence, Quesnay's system had but limited usefulness for practical policy. True, it advocated a policy of laissez-faire, a radical departure for the times. But in denigrating the industrial side of life, it flew against the sense of history, for the whole development of capitalism unmistakably pointed to the emergence of the industrial classes to the position of superiority over the landed classes. This was not congenial philosophy to Adam Smith. The notion of the circulation of wealth he gladly accepted and acknowledged, but the idea that industry was somehow sterile and barren struck him as a peculiar construction of the world. After all, had he not grown up in Kirkcaldy and Glasgow, where one could see wealth being created at every hand in the workshops and factories of craftsmen? But despite his rejection of the agricultural orientation of the physocrat cult, M. Quesnay's followers, like Mibiro, were nothing if not adultery. Smith had a profound personal admiration for the French doctor. Had it not been for Quesnay's death, the Wealth of Nations would have been dedicated to him. In 1766, the tour was brought to an abrupt halt when the Duke's younger brother, who had joined them, was murdered in the streets of Paris. His Grace returned to his estates in Dalkeith, and Smith went first to London and then to Kirkcaldy. Despite Hume's hindrances, there he stayed. Oh, man. For the better part of the next 10 years. While the great treatise took shape, most of it dictated standing against his fireplace and nervously rubbing his head against the wall until his pomade had made a dark streak on the paneling. Occasionally, he would visit his former charge on his estates at Dalkeith, and once in a while he would go to London to discuss his ideas with literati of the day. One of them was Dr. Samuel Johnson, whose select club Smith belonged, although he and the vulnerable lexicographer had hardly met under the most admirable of circumstances. Sir Walter Scott tells us that Johnson, on first seeing Smith, attacked him for some statement he made. Smith vindicated the truth of his concern. What did Johnson say? Was the universal inquiry. Why, he said Smith, with the deepest impression of resentment. He said, "You lie." And what did you reply? I said, "You are a son of a..." On such terms, says Scott, did these two great moralists first meet and part, and such was the classical dialogue between two great teachers of philosophy. Smith met as well a charming and intelligent American, one Benjamin Franklin, who provided him with a wealth of facts about the American colonies and a deep appreciation of the role which they might someday play. It is undoubtedly due to Franklin's influence that Smith subsequently wrote of the colonies that they constituted a nation which indeed seems very likely to become one of the greatest and most formidable that ever was in the world. In 1776, Wealth of Nations was published. 2 years later, Smith was appointed Commissioner of Customs for Edinburgh, a sincere worth £600 a year. Oh. A sinecure. Sinecure? Worth. Okay. £600 a year. With his mother, who lived until she was 90, Smith lived out his bachelor's life in peace and quiet, serene, content, and absent-minded to the end. And the book, it has been called the outpouring not only of a great mind, but of a whole epoch. Yet, it is not, in the strict sense of the word, an original book. There is a long line of observers before Smith who have approached this understanding of the world. Locke, Stewart, Law, Mandeville, Petty, Cantillon, not to mention Quesnay and Hume again. Smith took from all of them. There are over 100 authors mentioned by name in his treatise, but where others had fished here and there, Smith spread his net wider. Where others had clarified this and that issue, Smith illuminated the entire landscape. The Wealth of Nations is not wholly original book, but it is unquestionably a masterpiece. It is, first of all, a huge panorama. It opens with a famous passage describing the minute speculation of labor in the manufacture of pens and covers before it is done such a variety of subjects as the late disturbances in the American colonies. Evidently, Smith thought the Revolutionary War would be over by the time the book reached the press. The wastefulness of the student's life at Oxford, and the statistics on the herring catch since 1771. A glance at the index compiled for a later edition by Cannon shows the range of Smith's references and thoughts. Here are a dozen entries from the letter A. Abestes opulence of Sacron Empire under Abraham wage shekels, Abyssinia salt money, actors, public paid for contempt attending their profession. Africa, powerful king, much worse off than European peasant. Alehouses, the number of, not the efficient cause of drunkenness. Ambassadors, the first motive of their appointment. America, a solid page of references follows. Apprenticeship, the nature and this bound servitude explained. Arabs, their manner of supporting war. Army, no security to the sovereign against a disaffected clergy. In fine print, the index goes on for 63 pages. Before it ends, it has touched on everything. Riches, the chief of enjoyment of, consists of the parade of poverty, sometimes urges nation to inhuman customs. Stomach, desire for food, bound by narrow capacity of the butcher, brutal and odious business. When we have finished the 900 pages of the book, we have a living picture of England in the 1770s, of apprentices and journeymen, and rising capitalists, of landlords and clergymen, and kings, of factories and farms and foreign trade. The book is heavy going. It moves with all the deliberation of an encyclopedic mind, but not with the procession of an orderly one. This was an age when authors did not stop to qualify their ideas with ifs, ands, and buts. And it was an era when it was quite possible for a man of Smith's intellectual stature virtually to embrace the great body of knowledge of his times. Hence, the book ducks nothing, minimizes nothing, fears nothing. What an exasperating book. Again and again, it refuses to wrap up in a concise sentence the conclusion it has laboriously arrived at over 50 pages. The argument is so full of detail and observation that one consistently has to chip away the ornamentation to find the steel structure which holds it together underneath. Coming to silver, Smith detours for 75 pages to write a diversion on it. Coming to religion, he wanders off in a chapter on the sociology of morality. But for all its weightiness, the text is shot through with insights, observation, and well-turned phrases that imbue this great lecture with life. It was Smith who first called England a nation of shopkeepers. It was Smith who wrote, "By nature a philosopher is not ingenious and disposition half so different from the street porter as a mastiff is from a greyhound." And of the East India Company, which was then ravaging the East, he wrote, "It is a very singular government in which every member of the administration wishes to get out of the country as soon as he can, and to whose interest the day after he has left it and carried his whole fortune with him. It is perfectly indifferent, though the whole country was swallowed up by the earthquake." The Wealth of Nations is in no sense a textbook. Adam Smith is writing to his age, not to his classroom. He is expounding a doctrine which is meant to be of importance in running an empire, not an abstract treaty for socialistic distribution. The dragons which he slays, such as mercantile system, which takes over 200 pages to die, were alive and panting, if a little tired in his day. And finally, the book is a revolutionary one. To be sure, Smith would hardly have contents, content, that contestated an upheaval which disordered the gentlemanly classes and enthroned the common poor. But the import of the wealth of nations is revolutionary. Nonetheless, Smith is not, as is commonly supposed, an apologist for the up and coming Borgies. As we shall see, he is an admirer of their work, but suspicious of their motives, and mindful of the needs of the great laboring mass. But it is not his aim to espouse the interests of any class. He is concerned with promoting the wealth of an entire nation, and wealth to Adam Smith consists of the goods which all people of society consume. Note, all this is a democratic and hence radical philosophy of wealth. Gone is the notion of gold, treasures, kingly hoards. Gone prerogatives of merchants or farmers or working guilds. We are in the modern world where the flow of goods and services consumed by everyone constitutes the ultimate aim and end of economic life. And now, what are the lessons of the text? Two great problems absorb Adam Smith's attention. First, he is interested in laying bare the mechanism by which society hangs together. How is it possible for a community in which everyone is bustily following his self-interest not to fly apart from sheer centrifugal force? Centrifugal force. Which is it? Which guides each individual's private business so that it conforms to the needs of the group. With no central planning authority and no steadying influence of age-old tradition, how does society manage to get those tasks done which are necessary for survival? These questions lead Smith to a formulation of the laws of the market, which he sought was in the invisible hand, as he called it, whereby the private interests and passions of men are led in the direction which is most agreeable to the interest of the whole society. But the laws of the market will be only a part of Smith's inquiry. There is another question which interests him. Wither society. The laws of the market are like laws which explain how a spinning top stays upright. But there is also question of whether the top, by virtue of its spinning, will be moved along the table. To Smith and the great economists who followed him, society is not conceived as a static achievement of mankind which will go on reproducing itself, unchanged and unchanging from one generation to the next. On the contrary, society is seen as an organism which has its own life history, to discover the shape of things to come, to isolate the forces which impel society along its path. This is the grand objective of economic science. But until we have followed Smith's unraveling of the laws of the market, we cannot rush to the larger and more fascinating problem. For the laws of the market themselves will be an integral part of the larger laws which cause society to prosper or decay. The mechanism by which the mechanism by which the heedless individual is kept in line with everybody else will affect the mechanism by which society itself changes over the years. Hence, we begin with a look at the market mechanism. It is not the stuff that excites the imagination or stirs the pulse. Yet, for all its dryness, it has an immediacy which should lead us to consider it with a respectful eye. Not only are the laws of the market essential to the understanding of the world of Adam Smith, but these same laws will underlie the very different world of Karl Marx and the still different world in which we live today, since we are all, knowingly or otherwise, under their sovereignty. It behooves us to scrutinize them rather carefully. Adam Smith's laws of the market are basically simple. They tell us that the outcome of the certain kind of behavior in our certain social framework will bring about perfectly definite and forecastable results. Specifically, they show us how the drive of individual self-interest in an environment of similarly motivated individuals will result in competition. And they further demonstrate how competition will result in the provision of these goods that society wants, in the quantities that society desires, and at the prices society is prepared to pay. Let us see how this comes about. It comes about in the first place because self-interest acts as a driving power to guide men to whatever work society is willing to pay for. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, says Smith, but from their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our necessities, but of their advantages. But self-interest is only half the picture. It drives men to action. Something else must prevent the pushing of profit-hungry individuals from holding society up to exorbitant ransom. A community activated only by self-interest would be a community of ruthless profiteers. This regulator of competition, the socially beneficial consequence of the conflicting self-interests of the members of society, for each man out to do his best for himself with no thought of social cost, is faced with a flock of similarly motivated individuals who are in exactly the same boat. Each is only too eager to take advantage of his neighbor's greed if it urges him to exceed a common denominator of acceptable behavior. A man who permits his self-interest to run away with him will find that competitors have slipped in to take his trade away. If he charges too much for his wares, or if he refuses to pay as much as everybody else for his workers, he will find himself without buyers in the one case and without employees in the other. Thus, very much as in the theory of moral sentiments, the selfish motives of men wait. are transmuted by interaction to yield the most unexpected of results: social harmony. Consider, for example, the problem of high prices. Suppose we have 100 manufacturers of gloves. The self-interest of each one will cause him to wish to raise his price above his cost of production, and thereby to realize an extra profit. But he cannot. If he raises his price, his competitors will step in and take his market away from him by underselling him. Only if glove manufacturers combine and agree to maintain a solid front will an unduly high price be charged. And in this case, a collusive coalition could be broken by an enterprising manufacturer from another field, say shoemaking, who decided to move his capital into glove manufacture, where he could steal away the market by shading the price. But the laws of the market not only impose a competitive price on products, they also see to it that the producers of society heed society's demands for the quantities of goods it wants. Let us suppose that consumers decide they want more gloves than are being turned out. The fewer shoes, accordingly, the public will scramble for the stock of gloves on the market, and the shoe business will be dull. As a result, glove prices will tend to rise as consumers try to buy more of them than there are ready at hand, and shoe prices will tend to fall as the public passes the shoe stores by. But as glove prices rise, profits in the glove industry will rise too. And as shoe prices fall, profits in the shoe manufacturing will slump. Again, self-interest will step in to right the balance. Workers will be released from the shoe business of shoe factories, contract their output. They will move to the glove business, where business is booming. The result is quite obvious. Glove production will rise and shoe production will fall. And this is exactly what society wanted in the first place. As more gloves come on the market to meet demand, glove prices will fall back into line. Fewer shoes are produced, the surplus of shoes will soon disappear, and shoe prices will again rise up to normal. Through the mechanism of the market, society will have changed the allocation of its elements of production to fit the new desires. Yet no one has issued a dictum, and no planning authority has established schedules of output. Self-interest and competition, acting one against the other, have accomplished the transition. And one final accomplishment: just as the market regulates both prices and quantities of goods according to the final arbiter of public demand, so it also regulates the incomes of those who cooperate to produce those goods. If profits in one line of business are unduly large, there will be a rush of other businessmen into the field until competition has lowered surpluses. If wages are out of line in one kind of work, there will be a rush of men into the favored occupation until it pays no more than comparable jobs of that degree of skill and training. Conversely, if profits or wages are too low in one trade area, there will be an exodus of capital and labor until the supply is better adjusted to the demand. All this may seem somewhat elementary, but consider what Adam Smith has done. With his impetus of self-interest and his regulator of competition, first, he has explained how prices are kept from ranging arbitrarily away from the actual cost of producing a good. Second, he has explained how society can induce its producers of commodities to provide it with what it wants. Ah. Third, he has pointed out why high prices are a self-curing disease, for they cause production in those lines to increase. And finally, he has accounted for a basic similarity of incomes at each level of the great producing strata of the nations. In a word, he has found in the mechanism of the market a self-regulating system for society's orderly provisioning. No, self-regulating. The beautiful consequence of the market is that it is its own guardian. If output or price or certain kinds of remuneration stray away from their socially ordained levels, forces are set into motion to bring them back to the fold. It is a curious paradox which thus ensues the market, which is the acme of individual economic freedom, is the strictest taskmaster of all. One may appeal the ruling of a planning board or win a disposition of a minister, but there is no appeal to dispensation, whatever, from the anonymous pressures of the market mechanism. Economic freedom is thus more illusory than at first appearance. One can do as one pleases in the market, but if one pleases to do what the market disapproves, the price of individual freedom is economic ruination. Does the world really work this way? To a very real degree, it did in the days of Adam Smith. Even in his time, of course, there were already factors which acted as restraints against the free operation of the market system. There were combinations of manufacturers who rigged prices artificially high, and associations of journeymen who resisted the pressures of competition when it acted to lower their wages. And already there were more disquieting signs to be read. The Lumber Brothers factory was more than a mere marvel of engineering and a source of wonderment to the visitor. It betokened the coming of large-scale industry and the emergence of employers who were immediately powerful individual